referred to earlier, but I don't think there's a surviving manuscript of On Living to Oneself. But we do know that it was written at Winterslow Hut in 1821, at the beginning of 1821. And this place, Winterslow Hut, was a hotel, an inn in the countryside to the west of London on a coaching road, and Hazlitt would go there regularly throughout the period of his authorship to sort of seclude himself and write, but also be able to give what he wrote to the London coach that would take the material up to London to his editors and publishers who were working there. But he wrote this in early January 1821, and he wrote it. He had fallen in love into this obsessional love with Sarah Walker about 6 months previous to the writing of this essay. He had spent time in London with her, and then had gone away in December 1820, and so he's writing this essay while he's away from Sarah Walker, and some people find traces of that love affair and his anxiety about that love affair in the essay, but that's something that we may want to discuss or not. I mean, it raises a very interesting question about what is personal about the personal essay, and whether there's a boundary about the personal which needs to be observed, or whether the personal essay is a form of confession, or whether it's a form, of course, of artifice, whether it's a quite contrived display of personality. So, well, I have a number of questions about the essay, and one of them certainly has to do with the role of quotation in it. And I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on that, if you have any. But quite apart from that, I'd just be very interested to hear what what you made of it, whether you thought it was worth reading, or whether you thought it was tediously self-regarding, or whether it carried any resonance or echo for you. Or if you have any questions that you simply wanted to ask about it. Yeah, Savannah. Yeah, please do. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. No, uh, I think I think that's right. I mean, I think um, Hazlitt is, Hazlitt is trying to find a solution in this essay to um, the damage that he feels is inflicted on the self by living in an intensely competitive and rivalrous world. Um, and of course, living in an intensely competitive and rivalrous world is, as you're suggesting, Sabana, part of that's where you get into envy, of course, because the envious disposition is precisely one that has been afflicted by the success of another, and who thinks of others in terms of their success and failure. Of course, there is a, I mean, we'll perhaps come when we've had a few more thoughts about the essay to the passage where he does think enviously, or at least he thinks in a very interestingly, ironically envious way about Byron. But we'll perhaps come to that a bit later. But I think, yeah, I mean, he on living to oneself, as he says early on in the essay, means um, being in the world but not of it, and that is part of well, let's think about it a bit further. The essay is reflecting on this, but there is also, I don't know if you noticed, there's a narrative dimension to this essay. Did you see that, notice that at all? There's a kind of story in it. One place where you can see that happening is right at the beginning. I never was in a better place or humour than I am at present for writing on this subject. Does that have any echoes for you, or ring any bells? It's a very interesting piece of artifice, isn't it? He's he's writing, he's dramatizing himself writing the essay. I mean, he's narrating himself writing the essay in the moment of writing it. I was never in, I never was in a better place or humour than I am at present for writing on this subject. It's as though he's trying to invite you into the thought that what you're reading is something that's being written in the here and now, in a sort of in the present. So he's not, as it were, taking a big reflective distance on, well, when I was a young man, you know, da-di-da-di-da. No, he wants, so threaded through the essay is a story, in a sense, about what happens as he writes the essay. And it seems to me that one of the things that he's doing, this story, is about, the story is not simply the essay is not simply a description of living to oneself. He's also approaching a moment when he will declare for this as it concerns him. He will come out as somebody who in future will live to himself. Okay, so the essay is, so to speak, enacting a moment of decision. He's drawn to the idea of on living to oneself, then he wonders about it, and then he's drawn back to it again, but then he declares at a certain moment this is the way he's going to go. So I think there's that sort of, it's a subdued element of narrative in the essay, but it is there. This may be thought of as another aspect of its being a personal essay. It's an essay about a person coming to a decision. Any other thoughts that you had about it, or I mean, what did you make of the quotations? Why do you think there are so many quotations in the essay? Yep. Rupsha, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was going to talk about something that you said, whether the essay resonated with us while reading it. Something that really made itself uh, remarkable to me is that he's very concerned with the idea of contemplation and how whether contemplation is possible in the present state of affairs as they were during his time. And that I think is a question that we are still struggling with today. And he anticipates it very, very long ago, if we think about it.
He does, yes. Um, I mean, I think you're right about that. It is an essay about the possibility of living a contemplative existence rather than an active existence, and where and how you might do that. Um, it, I referred to quotation, or asked a question about quotation. The title of the essay is actually a quotation, and this is not gratuitous in relationship to the issue that you've just raised. The On Living to Oneself is a translation from the Latin of a letter by the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who wrote on exactly this subject. And I think that in this essay, Hazlitt is, as it were, alluding to, is perhaps resonating with that Stoic tradition. The Stoics, remember, felt that the wise form of life consisted in only seeking to regulate that which you could regulate, and there was a great deal that you couldn't. There was a great deal that existed beyond your control, and natural necessities, natural laws, obviously one's own finitude, one's own mortality, illness, grief, and the when one's thinking of a philosophy here, it's very important to bear in mind that they're not, when Seneca writes as a Stoic philosopher, he is writing about philosophy as a way of life. He's not writing about philosophy as an abstract, teachable discipline that you kind of learn in a curriculum. And therefore, when he writes in the way that he does, he writes this letter to a younger friend as part of a way of encouraging him to cultivate those states of mind which will encourage a calm acceptance of the way in which life is, of getting a measure distance between oneself and the world. And there's a Latin term, ataraxia, for this state of calm, which can be brought about through a form of self-discipline, through a form of self-regulation, which is engaged by repeated study, by writing things down, internalizing them. That helps in this form of self-cultivation. And I think it's a very interesting question about Hazlitt's essay, is whether it is seeking that state of ataraxia, of calm, and that part of the essay's sort of work is the attempt to achieve that calm. The other thing about it that resonates very strongly with the Stoic tradition is that it displays two states that the Stoics recommended. One of them was to live in the present. Don't worry about the future. Be anxious about it. It's not in your control. So don't start worrying about it. Live in the present. I never was in a better place or humour than I am at present for writing on this subject. Okay. He foregrounds himself living in the present. And then another dimension of Stoic thought is that you should live in relationship to a form of cosmic awareness, that you should live in relationship to a sense of the whole dimension of the universe, right? As well as living in the present. If you go right to the end of the essay, when he quotes from the 18th century aristocrat Bolingbroke's Reflections on Exile, you'll see exactly that Stoic formula being reenacted when he writes, whatever is best is safest. Such is the great and beautiful work of nature, the world. Such is the mind of man, which contemplates and admires the world, whereof it makes the noblest part. These are inseparably ours, and as long as we remain in one, we shall enjoy the other. Okay, so if you can live in this sense of your being within this huge, large cosmic order, it means that little things don't bother you. Little upsets don't bother you. You're aware of yourself in a much larger dimension. Now, I think there's a very interesting question here about the extent to which you see this as corresponding to other meditative traditions or not. I mean, I haven't thought this through at all, but I do think it gives us a striking insight into the essay as a genre, and that is that one way of thinking about it is as a meditative practice. Of course, that's very different from, writing an essay in order to get a B, 90 marks or 70 marks, obviously, but it's because obviously the essay has this academic existence, massive academic existence. We all write essays, students and later on, but here this is a form of essay writing which is not concerned with that kind of evaluation. Sorry, Sabana, you wanted to come back in? Good. Yeah, he is. He is. He is. He certainly. Well, there's a. I think you're right about that. What is striking about it is, of course, that what he does is he uses. Well, let's just step back for a moment and think about what a quotation is. A quotation brings another's voice into the text that you are writing. So it immediately sets up an interaction between two voices, if you like. I mean, a kind of, if you wanted to push it, you might say into a form of dialogue. But I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be set apart as quotation. It would just be absorbed into your own words, as it were. It's a way of signaling that these words are not my words. It's a very interesting modality in that respect. And if you follow that thought up a little bit further into the essay, one of the things that is striking generically about many of the quotations is that they're from poems rather than from prose. Not all, but the majority of them. And the majority of them are not acknowledged. They've been anonymized. I mean, the epigraph quotation, remote, unfriended, melancholy, slow, or by the lazy Scheldt or wandering Poe, comes from the poet Goldsmith. And what is being snipped out of a larger poem and placed as an epigraph, what it does is it brings into the orbit of the essay a figure which is of the exile and the melancholic. Okay. And then other quotations seem to be brought in support of the idea of on living to oneself. So Wordsworth is brought in, the man whose eye is ever on himself doth look on one, the least of nature's works. Okay, this is against sort of self-regard, right? So, and that self-regard is one of the things that stands in the way of living to oneself. Living to oneself is not living in a self-obsessed way, it's living in a way that is indifferent to how you're thought of by others. And the quotations go on, I think, in that form. It's like, if you wanted to convince people that what you're saying has some validity, one of the ways in which you do it is by saying, well, look, other people think like me too. It's, if you like, a way of establishing a form of group thinking in the essay itself. Look, there are all these people who think the same. They're these highly revered or important figures. They think along roughly the same lines. There's as it were an accumulation of wisdom that I can draw on here to support my own position. Then this undergoes a distinct change when the longest quotation comes, and it's from Byron, and it's the quotation that begins, "I have not loved the world, nor the world love me." And this comes from a very one of the most widely read poems in the early 19th century Britain, anyway, and that was Byron's poem Childe Harold. And you'll notice that something quite odd happens here, because we enter the quotation. I don't know if you have got the essay to hand, because I think it's quite an interesting transition moment. Hazlitt writes, there's this, long, impassioned sentence. "If love at first sight were mutual, or to be conciliated by kind offices, if the fondest affection were not so often repaid and chilled by indifference and scorn, if so many lovers, both before and since the madman in Don Quixote, had not worshipped a statue, hunted the wind, cried aloud to the desert, if friendship were lasting, if merit were renown, and renown were health, riches, and long life, or if the homage of the world were paid to conscious worth and the true aspirations after excellence, instead of its gaudy signs and outward trappings, then indeed I might be of the opinion that it's better to live to others than oneself. But as the case stands, I incline to the negative side of the question." Okay, so here he's coming to declare himself, right? He's coming to the moment of decision. Then he quotes from Byron. So you think, well, no, this quotation is coming in support of this. "I have not loved the world, nor the world me." Okay. Then look at what follows. See the way in which, when you're thinking about quotation, it's always worth thinking about how the quotation is assimilated into the text. How is it incorporated into the text? Notice what Hazlitt writes after this long quotation from Byron. "Sweet verse embalms the spirit of sour misanthropy, but woe betide the ignoble prose writer who should dare thus to compare notes with the world, or tax it roundly with imposture." So do you see what's happening here? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, but it's actually, I think, quite an interesting moment in the essay. What do you think he's saying about these verses by Byron? What is he drawing our attention to? Notice how he characterizes the prose writer as ignoble. You remember, Byron is an aristocrat. Byron's a noble. The prose writer is ignoble. Hazlitt is ignoble. This is a commoner commenting on the writing of an aristocrat. I mean, that's part of the subtext. Sorry. Yes. Yes. Well, I think he sweet verse embalms the spirit of sour misanthropy. The aristocratic Byron can get away with reviling the world because he says it so elegantly, he says it so sweetly, that it will be received as part of his status, almost. That it won't anger the world that he renounces it in this way, because it's done in sweet verse. But this goes back to your point about envy earlier on. It also sets up a rivalry between the verse writer, the sweet verse writer, and the unsweet, presumably prose writer, the rough-edged prose writer, perhaps, because you'll notice that within terms of the drama of the essay about attaining a state of contemplative calm, this moment in the essay drags him back into rivalry. It drags him back into rivalry with Byron, because what he will now do is go on to denounce the world in prose. This is the paragraph that begins, "If I had sufficient provocation to rail at the public," and so on. "There is no more mean, stupid, dastardly, pitiful, selfish, spiteful, envious, ungrateful animal than the public." I mean, he's really letting go, or he gives the appearance of really letting go with a kind of vitriolic denunciation of everything that he, that he hates about the public, about his readers. This is, remember, he's in a sense kind of writing about his readers here. And he wants to outbid Byron in prose. He wants to show that the prose writer can denounce the world more authentically, perhaps, than the aristocratic prose writer. But of course, that creates a dilemma for him, because he's been sucked back into a world that he wants to separate himself from. And that's again what happens in the remaining parts of the essay, is that having delivered this denunciation, it's as though he feels that he's got it off his chest. It's almost like an emotional release. Now that he's denounced it, he can be free from it. It's as though that was sort of waiting there for him to... Sorry, Ruksha, you wanted to...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
As you said that here Hazlitt was vehemently castigated by the conservatists. So can it be that following paragraph, which says that he does not like the public, can it be his own frustration that he was castigated and he was kind of amidst the vitriolic attacks?
Yes, I think that's certainly a part of what he has in mind, definitely. That he's in a sense, he's settling a score. So in one sense, it's quite it appears to be quite a personal display of anger and aggression. But of course, it's done with an extraordinary degree of imagistic invention and the power of ridicule. This is a highly controlled piece of prose writing, in fact. I mean, look at the way in which he personifies the public. It has a lion's mouth, the heart of a hare, with ears erect and sleepless eyes. Okay, it's prepared to roar. It's prepared to make a lot of noise in denunciation, but in fact, it's cowardly. It's timid in its heart, and it's always on the lookout for what's new, what's coming next, I mean, it seems a bit like social media in some senses, but I don't know whether that is quite the same thing. But there's a similar. You can see what he's. It's an extraordinary and great inventive image. I mean, it's not a. It's a. And there's also a control in the prose rhythms here as well, I think, which is very striking. Long sentences alternating with short and so on. Yeah. 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 No. Well, yes. Yes. And it's as though, yes, I mean, what he wants to, what he's wanting to denounce is the volatility of public opinion, the way in which it's can change so rapidly. And the other thing that he wants to criticize is its imitative character, is the way in which it repeats rather than thinks. And that this creates divisions that are artificial. So it reads the Edinburgh and Quarterly Review and believes them both. One is a liberal and one is a conservative journal. Okay, just the Edinburgh is liberal, Quarterly is conservative. Or if there is a doubt, Malice turns the scale. And then you can see, to go back to your point about the conservative denunciation, you can see that, again, the turn to the personal that is made here. Taylor and Hesse, that's the name of his publishers, told me that they had sold nearly 2 editions of the characters of Shakespeare's plays in about 3 months, but that after the Quarterly Review of them came out, they never sold another copy. So you've got the freelance professional writer exposed exposed to public opinion. And so he's settling that score there too. And then he goes on to refer to the denunciation of the Cockney school. This is, but the interesting thing is that there's also an emotional process, I think, at work here, which is of him wanting to rid himself of a feeling as much as express it, which I think fits into the idea that the essay might be an attempt to achieve that state of ataraxia or calm, which I mentioned earlier. But I think it's also very striking that in the end he sort of runs out of steam. This is another thing that's again very interesting about the essay as a form. If you go towards the end, he says, "Enough. My soul turn from them, and let me try to regain the obscurity and quiet that I love, far from the madding strife." That's a misquotation from Gray. "In some sequestered corner of my own or some far distant land." And then what happens very interestingly here is that a lengthy quotation finishes the essay. So the voice of another comes in. And it's very striking that it's a prose quotation. And interestingly enough, it's from an aristocrat. I mean, I don't know, if you think about the kind of the sort of complex questions about social status and writing of prose and poetry that are in play in the essay, it's very striking, I think, that this is the quotation that Hazlitt calls upon, as it were, to complete an essay that in a sense he himself feels he can no longer live with, or no longer write, rather. So those are some thoughts about On Living to Oneself. Are there any other questions or comments you'd like to make?
I was reminded of while discussing the concept of contemplation and his indecisiveness. So, like the essay form in which he's writing, this is solely based on the fact that there is a reading public which is present, which will read him. So there's the kind of a kind of dual intent in that. And I was reminded of, so we did for one of our courses Petrarch's Life of Solitude, and there we read that how Petrarch wanted, so Petrarch didn't have the kind of public discourse to which Hazlitt is responding to, but then Petrarch had this kind of indecisiveness between contemplation. At the same time, he couldn't really live outside the limelight for long, and he is writing that he wants contemplation, but then he has his own kind of contemplation where he has his books and friends and the select public who will appreciate him and whose company he will enjoy. So I was reminded of that in our discussion.
Yes, well, it's a very interesting comparison, and I think you quite rightly draw our attention to something which is perhaps problematic about the essay. I don't know, and that is to think of it as, of course, as a form of self-advertisement. I mean, that he's performing this in front of a public, his reading public, and he's clearly, in a sense, inviting his reading public to sympathize with him, I think. Or maybe he's not. I don't know whether he's trying to antagonize them or invite them into a sympathetic relationship with him. I'm not sure. But when I mean, when Seneca writes a letter, it does get some circulation, but it's not. He's not writing in the context that Hazlitt is writing in, which is a context where Hazlitt is commercially dependent, financially dependent, economically dependent upon pleasing a reading public, and therefore, is and did develop a certain kind of personality through writing. So he's if we think of the essay by way of a contemporary analogy, it's like a celebrity denouncing celebrity culture. But I don't think that disqualifies it. It still seems to me to, I mean, I've read it often, and it still seems to me to, there's a kind of strange alternation in it between something that's on the verge of self-pity and something that is on the verge of self-composure, as though, so there's a kind of complex play in it of feeling, I think. There's a very good essay, and I can't remember this by Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American mid-19th-century transcendentalist, and he's writing about moods, and he's writing about the idea that we should take moods very seriously. But he has this very striking formulation: our moods do not agree with each other. And he goes on to elaborate this by saying, the happiness that I feel, or the joy that I feel in this moment, or the sense I feel of having achieved something in my work at this moment, will be contradicted in a week's time by my depression, or something like that. Okay, so this is, and Hazlitt's writing, and again, I think essays can be very interestingly attuned to this moodiness, to the fact that our experience of the world is conditioned by our moods. And there is a sort of interesting drama of moods that can occur in Hazlitt's essays, and perhaps in other essays as well, but certainly in Hazlitt's essays. And this is partly a reflection of the fact, of course, that he was very strongly drawn towards drama as a form, notably through Shakespeare, and that what he prized in drama was the clash of passions, of one passion hitting up against another. So there's an interesting question there, I think, about the exhibition of moods in essay form, and the way in which you can read an essay in terms of the transition from one mood to another and back again, perhaps.
So if I
Yeah.
I was
Go ahead.
thinking about quotations and the use of quotations in this essay, as you were pointing out. And something that's interesting is that he cites, so to speak, Bolingbroke quite in some detail, which he does not do for most of the rest of his quotations. And I I have two observations, questions on that. One is whether his audience and whether he would expect his audience to be familiar with most of the quotations that he uses. For example, of course, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and Byron. Uh, and also whether by not citing them, by anonymizing them to some extent, and also perhaps expecting his audience to know uh, the quotes that he uses, he is kind of drawing them in, giving them a sense of, um, how should I put it, that they're in a circle with the essayist, a sort of conversational tone that they would be familiar with these names that he's using or not using. So I was wondering if there's any value to that line of thought.
Yes, I think there is. It's it's very hard to know with any degree of precision what his audience would have known, whether to what extent they shared a common culture, a shared set of, because after all, a common culture is, amongst other things, a shared set of references. I very much doubt that the majority of Hazlitt's readers had read as much as he had. And I very much doubt that they remembered it in the way that he did. He had apparently an extraordinary memory for quotation. But on the other hand, whether you know the source of the quotation or not, or whether you know the original context of the quotation or not, in a sense doesn't matter. Because what is happening, and I think this is where your thought about conversation is very striking, is that these voices are being brought into a conversation, right? They're not being brought in order to then be the subject of some learned commentary or elaboration. They're being brought in because it seems an appropriate time for them to come into as it were, into the conversational exchange. And remember that the title of the essay collection that this is drawn from is Table Talk around a table. Kind of so it's deliberately evoking not the lecture room or the pulpit or those spaces. It's, as it were, inviting us to imagine the space of a group of people sitting around a table talking one to another about things that they think are of interest to them. And Hazlitt's idea of good conversation was that was how it would proceed, and that there was a kind of tact about conversation, which means that when a subject had been gone into, as he puts it, sufficiently, then you'd leave it. You wouldn't push it too hard, so to speak. You wouldn't want to turn it into a detailed analysis. Now, one of the things that resonates with is the work of another writer before Hazlitt, the philosopher David Hume, who was an essayist as well. He wrote essays in a very different manner to Hazlitt's, but he interestingly saw the essay as occupying a space between, on the one hand, highly academic discourse, and he thought there was a danger in highly academic discourse becoming self-obsessed, obscure, unassimilable. So that was one pole. The other pole was the triviality of certain kinds of social conversation, chit-chat. And the essay is placed by Hume between those two extremes, if you like to think of them as extremes. It has the virtues of conversation. It brings a certain degree of learning and of thoughtfulness and a reflectiveness into the conversation, but it doesn't seek to treat with a kind of academic exhaustiveness the subjects that it's engaged with. And it's very striking that even in that period, in the 18th century, there was an alertness to the idea that there was a danger of a certain kind of obscurantism or esotericism attaching to academic discourse. And Hume, who's certainly one of the most brilliant philosophers of the 18th century, he didn't think of himself as an academic.
This reminded me of something we read in Schiller. We were reading the German Romantics in class, and Schiller talks about this problem of targeting the academic community or the working class as the standards of judging art, because the academic community has a danger of becoming too self-obsessed, and the working class is not at the time well read enough for Schiller, not learned enough, and he was talking about the creation of a middle class as the ideal audience.
Good, right? Yes,
it's interesting in this context as well.
I think it is, but it in the case of Hazlitt, you have this extreme ambivalence about the public. On the one hand, he, in his Life of Napoleon, he describes the French Revolution as the remote result of the invention of the art of printing and of the circulation of ideas in printed discourse, in printed form, meaning that they can be engaged with by a much larger community. They can be debated. There can be what famously is called the public sphere can be created around this dissemination of opinion, and for Hazlitt, as for others, this could be viewed as a form of enlightenment, as a form of ever expanding rationality and a capacity for making reasoned decisions, reasoned critiques, and so on and so forth. So there's that sense that of the public. On the other hand, and this becomes increasingly the case for him in the period after the defeat, during the Napoleonic Wars and after the defeat of Napoleon, the public are corrupted by false opinion. They're manipulated, they're easily led. It's an anticipation of the kind of fear that Orwell will have about the effect of politics on the English language, for example, that the very forms that there's a sort of dilemma, the very forms that seem to be able to promote enlightenment seem to at the same time produce its opposite. And I think that's a dilemma that Hazlitt's work inhabits. Yeah, Savannah. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. No, good connections, and of course, I mean, Schiller's essay is very interesting, isn't it? Insofar as it's a diagnosis of a modern condition, isn't it? And what is fundamental to his diagnosis of the modern condition is that we have become separated from nature, and you'll notice traces of a similar nostalgia in this essay, where once upon a time I lived in this way, in this unity, and then it was lost. And this the one of the interesting things I think in Schiller in the sentimental is the way in which the sentimental is identified, and this again is part of its diagnosis of modernity, with a form of mourning. It is mourning that nature which has been lost, and which perhaps can never be recovered again. Now, I mean, how this gets played out in many different ways, this dilemma, I think, but that's the way in which Schiller largely frames it. It's a fascinating essay. I agree, and but again, it helps us to identify something of the of 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 what is romantic, I think, in Hazlitt as well. If you go to the essay I mentioned earlier, which is the essay called My First Acquaintance with Poets, that's an extraordinary evocation of a golden moment, the revolutionary moment of 1798, which has been lost. That's the point. As much as anything, its importance, its value resides in the sense that it is lost, and that things didn't work out in the way that time had promised.
Sir, if I may,
Yeah.
while reading the essay, I recalled Thoreau's idea of pastoralism, and especially in the first two paragraphs, Hazlitt says that he is writing by looking at the window at the wide bare heath before himself. And then in On the Living Poets, we also see that Hazlitt says that love of nature is usually the first idea of the poets. So I I think this can be read as a I attempted to read this work as a pastoral idea in the first two paragraphs. And coincidentally, also Schiller's naive and sentimental poetry is also important for pastoralism itself. I,
Now, again, I think that's a very striking thought. I I think it has to be, in Hazlitt's case, set alongside his critique of Wordsworth, um, and he criticised Wordsworth on at least two grounds. One was that he thought Wordsworth was a, a, a consummate egotist, because he always saw the world in terms as the instrument for the expression of his feelings. He absorbed the world into himself in the way in which Hazlitt thought about it. He also disagreed with that living in a village was good for you, that you lived close to nature by living a village life. He was quite sarcastic about that. But nonetheless, I do think you're right about that, those elements of pastoral sensibility that kind of come up in Hazlitt's work. And I think, though, when you're thinking about Hazlitt specifically, you always have to juxtapose it with the urban figure, with a writer who I sometimes think of by analogy, not with any English writer, but with the French poet Baudelaire. This is a person who goes out to the country. He doesn't live in it. He always goes back to the city. The city is his milieu.
so a sort of a borderland between.
Well, almost, but he the kind of writer he was the kind of writer that urban conditions enabled. I mean, there's an urban publishing industry enabled, that readerships, urban readerships. So he has that urban sensibility, which is very alert to fluctuations in fashion, for example. I mean, he doesn't like fluctuations in fashion, but he's very alert to them. He's very alert to the way in which, values change. Something comes into fashion, something falls out of fashion. He he writes about urban living. He writes about the streets of Holborn. You know, he writes about the theatres that are in Covent Garden. He's an habitué of an urban scene, and goes out to the country and delights in it. But then, as I said before, comes back to the city I mean, he doesn't devalue urban experience, is the point I'm trying to make. Whereas Wordsworth increasingly divorces himself from urban experience, it seems to me. So, okay, yeah. Carry on, sorry. Mm, yes, 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 yes. And I think this, draws us into that another idea about the essay, which has been discussed extensively in thinking about it, and that is that it is a form of well, it it's a form of self-invention, I guess, and I think and therefore has a performative character to it. It's a way of testing out. I mean, it's famously the case that the first great essayist is the French writer Montaigne, and essay is connected to the French word essayer, which means to test, to try out, to experiment. And I think that, I mean, you wouldn't want to read this essay and say, well, yes, after Hazlitt had written this essay, he became a figure of stoic composure, because that would be biographically completely untrue from what we know about him. But it also wouldn't be confirmed by other essays that he wrote. There is, however, an interesting concern with the exploration of happiness and with what might constitute happiness. If we were to continue, I'd pair this with another very interesting later essay by Hazlitt called on going on a journey. Where he writes about the hopefulness that always accompanies the setting out on a journey, whatever else might happen subsequently. But no, the essay is, I think, intimately connected with another thing, with another sense of the way in which, and this is why I was talking about moods in the way that I was before, about the changing nature of the self, its changefulness. And that in turn provokes a question about what, if any, is its constancy. And that seems to me the kind of perspective out of which Hazlitt writes. And then you find your permanences, so to speak, you can find them in art. And for Hazlitt, that would mean the paintings of Titian or the plays of Shakespeare. That those are those constitute values which won't change. That might be one stabilizing reference. But they're not. They're. It's very important to Hazlitt that they are. That what you encounter when you encounter a play or an artwork is you encounter something that's outside yourself. I'm going to need to come to an end fairly soon, if that's okay. Are there any other questions or that you want to ask before we finish? Anything that you feel we have? I mean, there's so much to say about the essay. We've just sort of begun to dip into it, but there may be some other insight that you have, because they've been the thoughts that you've had have been very helpful to me in thinking about other contexts for the essay. So thank you for those. But I wonder, does anybody else want to say something more before we come to an end? No? Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear of the existence of this group, and I hope you go on to have some more good meetings. Do you have a reading plan in mind, or? Oh, good. Okay, great. Yeah, good. Sure. Yeah. Well, no, good. And yeah, good luck with it. And get back in touch if you want to at some point or another, if you feel like it. No, he's very little read and studied. I mean, there's as I said earlier, there is quite a big scholarly and critical interest in him, but I'm not sure how many. Well, yeah, undergraduate students, MA students in Romanticism would certainly read him in Britain, but not only one or two essays. Okay, pleasure. Okay. Oh no. Oh good. Okay. Oh right. Thanks. Yes. Okay. Yes, that's a biography I wrote about that love affair. Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, I may be coming over with my colleague Dan Rycroft to Jadavpur in sometime next year. So, but I'll tell you if I am. Okay. All right. Yeah. Good. Okay. Pleasure. Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Bye.
sir.
Bye.